All right, folks, we're back with the rest of, or at least part of the rest of this discussion about language and how it's a cognitive universal. We're going to talk about what a language is and a little bit about how we develop them. So, language has 4 basic requirements according to your textbook. Linguists don't agree on all these. Some of them have much longer lists, and they're also very technical. So these are the 4 that it all kind of boils down to across everybody's lists. These are the most agreed upon ones. Languages need to have semantics. That means meaning. You need to have an utterance that has some kind of meaning. So utterances are, we say a lot of things that are not full words or sentences, right? We make sounds. So or even gestures or writing. So we're calling an utterance like any little tiny communication unit, anything that you say, no matter the method. Your utterances need to have meaning. They are symbols that stand for something, and there's an agreement about what they mean. That's pretty, I think we take that one for granted. I think that one's very basic and very well understood. It's a basis for any communication. But lots of communication systems that are not languages have this system of semantics. So we need a few more qualifications to call it language. We need to use a universal medium to communicate it. Universal media in human language, well, that's redundant. Only humans have language. Universal media in language include articulatory utterances, so that means our speech, and gestural utterances, or our hands. We are wired to learn to use either one of these to learn an entire language, an entire system of communication. Writing is not a universal medium. People commonly put this on the quizzes and the tests, no matter what I tell them. So writing is not a universal medium. Writing is weird in the history of the human race. We have only been writing for a blink of an eye, maybe 4,000 or 5,000 years, and the most. And something like 10,000 years ago, we just started farming and living in bigger organized societies. But we've had the same brain and body, whole human setup for about 1,000,000 years. So we've only been writing for a tiny little blip in that timeline. And not everybody writes and reads. We take for granted that we live in a culture with extremely high literacy now, but that's if writing itself is a blink of an eye, the fact that nearly everybody can read and write is, I don't really know what's shorter than a blink, sorry, but I think you get the idea. It's way, way, way more recent, like a 20th century thing. 19th started increasing, 20th, and some parts of the world still have pretty low literacy rates, but our education system rapidly changed along with industrialization, and that's when everybody started to be able to read. So our writing is very tied to our economic system and our political systems. So, oh, sorry, my previous video was recording, I guess. Just popped up and let me know. Sorry about that. So again, writing's weird. I think I've been over this. Only a few cultures ever developed it, and some of the others just copied them because it was a cool idea and they could see that people were flourishing with this idea. I would go a step further in my imagination and say a few weird people invented writing. My understanding of this does come from historical examples. So, the vast majority of cultures, again, never developed a writing system, never needed one. Especially when you're a nomad, you don't need words that stay somewhere because you're not even staying somewhere. You just need to communicate about the present moment. When you start farming, though, think about that. When you start farming, you have to plan way more ahead of time, like many months, years even. So about what you're going to plant where and how to do that and how long it takes these plants to develop and, harvesting. to feed yourself and your family for many more months. Suddenly life got way more complicated. But you could store up grain without having to write about it, I guess. People were doing it, it's possible. But I'm imagining that there's just like one strange person in like a village who just really is like obsessed with scratching around in the dirt or on rocks, and to everybody else it looks super bizarre. Until one day they notice this person has like way more grain than everybody else, like they have more cattle, they got a bigger house with a nice wall built around it, and they're like, maybe those scratches weren't so crazy after all. Sort of like computers, right? They used to be super nerdy, and now they're, well, I mean, people have made tons of money on them. There's all those memes about how people used to stuff Bill Gates in a locker, and now all those people work under him and that sort of thing, right? So, what's just the purview of obsessive nerds, and now it's ubiquitous. Everybody knows how to use some kind of computer. Maybe writing developed like this, and it's not just my imagination and big leaps in analogies that I'm using. So in the Americas, we saw situations where pre-literate cultures or non-literate cultures um, adapted or even created writing systems for their own unique languages after European contact. So in um, East Alabama, where I'm from, we studied the Cherokee quite a lot because they used to live in that area. Many of them still do. There's the Eastern Band of Cherokee that live in parts of Tennessee near the Smoky Mountains, and that's sort of their like holy origin site of their creation myths too, is in the lower Appalachians. So we grew up hearing about Sequoia, who created the syllabary or writing system for the Cherokee language. He experimented with many, many different symbols and writing systems over a very long period of time. And he was able to do this uniquely. Not many grown men in Cherokee culture would have been able to do this because you got work to do, right? You've got to farm, you got to hunt. People have work to do. But as a young child, he had a hunting accident that disabled one of his legs, and he wasn't able to walk around very much. He walked with a cane, he couldn't go out hunting anymore. He couldn't do many of the physical labor tasks that his culture normally would have required. It's actually, his name comes from that. Sequoia means pig leg. It was kind of a, I don't know, a mean nickname. So he was obsessed with this language thing. As soon as he heard about the fact that Europeans could preserve their culture, that's something that he was concerned with, preserving his culture and communicating with his people in their own language in a way that could stay. He was so obsessed with this idea, he had like a whole workshop, and that's like all he did. His wife and daughter got so sick of his bizarro hobby that they burned down his work studio. Because he just kept fiddling with this crap in the garage, right? Instead of doing real work or talking to them or whatever it is. So I can only imagine that writing itself could have been invented in a similar way. It might have looked very unusual and not normative and even disruptive to society, but over time ended up being a net good. So I think we've established that writing is not a universal medium, but utterances and gestures are. So if you never heard a spoken language, you would probably start gesturing, and deaf people who don't have anyone to teach them sign language, these children develop their own little systems of communication with their hands. Humans are very wired to do this, deaf or hearing. And we use the same brain areas to do that as well. It's fascinating. It's like those are completely interchangeable to our brain. We can learn a language using these, we can learn a language using this. It's the same as far as our brain is concerned. Develops on the same schedule. Deaf infants babble with their hands. They make similar grammar mistakes with their hands. It's fascinating. So I think you get the point. We need a meaning and we need a medium. We also need what's called syntax, which is sort of like grammar. It's basically grammar. It means that arranging those same words in different orders has different meanings. And we take this for granted. Nobody has to tell us this. We absorb the grammar from our native language as children. We also have what's called pragmatics, which is social conventions. We absorb these quite a bit as well. Some languages have masculine and feminine grammar. Some languages have phrases that you are supposed to say to your elders. Some languages have what we call honorifics. So in English, we used to have a more complicated honorific system. So I go by Dr. Kirby, but before I got my doctorate, I went by Ms. Kirby, for example, which is MS dot. But I've noticed that all the feminine honorifics, we pronounce the same way now, whereas older generations pronounce them, they're spelled differently and they use them differently. So if you're a millennial or a Generation Zer, you probably grew up calling a lot of your teachers just Miss whatever, regardless of whether they were married. It sounded the same as MISS. Married women go by MRS, Mrs. Married name, right? Unmarried women would go by Miss, MISS. And then Ms. is MS, none of your business. My social status isn't based on whether I'm married or not. So, but people pronounce these all the same, and I noticed that in email they used to write the wrong ones as well. Sometimes people still do. It's Dr. Kirby these days, guys. Pragmatics also can include things you're not supposed to say, so stuff that's considered taboo or swearing in your language. That's going to be different all across languages, right? So, human languages have all of these things. All human languages do. Animal communication systems, non-human animal communication systems, sometimes have some of these things, but never all of them. So communication systems have semantics. Animals can do this. Your cat probably has different meows that mean, help me, you close the bedroom door and I can't get through. Or it has meows that say, my bowl is only half empty and I can't eat out of it unless it's completely full. Or something of that nature, right? Your babies might have distress cries versus I'm just kind of tired, or I'm kind of hungry, or I'm in pain, or whatever, different cries. But those aren't languages. They don't have any of these other pieces. Other animals and young children who don't have language yet can use semantics. They don't always use universal media, so other animals can't use the same articulatory or gestural things as we do because they have different equipment. Some of them can use some of the same ones, like birds can copy our voices, and, apes can use some of our sign languages, some of our words in sign language. What animal communication definitely doesn't have is syntax, which is like grammar. So a lot of these really smart apes that have been trained to use sign language still don't arrange the words in novel ways. They understand that there's a word that gets me food or a word that gets me to go outside, but they don't make brand new sentences they've never heard before, which human children do constantly. And they don't understand that taking those same words and just flipping them around can actually have a different meaning. Animal communication certainly also does not have pragmatics, which is, again, those social conventions. You can train animals to be kind of polite, but they're not going to absorb as they're developing these requirements of what's okay to say to whom, when, and how. So these four things all together are what's unique about human communication. Now, I mentioned we're going to talk some about language development, which I think I've already gone over some. Humans are really prepared for language. There's what we call universal grammar. Now, all of our languages are different. Human languages, some of them share some grammar features. Some of them share pretty much nothing in common as far as the sounds that they use, the order they have to put words in, the way you make different tenses, what pronouns you use. They can be completely different. But what we mean by universal grammar is that languages all have grammar. Children come into the world prepared to absorb some kind of grammar rules and to repeat them back, and nobody has to explicitly teach them those rules for them to develop it. You may think, oh, hold up. Yeah, you definitely have to teach people grammar because we have terrible grammar. Just look around, look at social media, listen to anybody talk. But I would encourage you not to think about differences in the way that certain cultures or groups of people speak as wrong. Yeah, absorb that for a second. What you were taught in school means that it's the language and the system used by the dominant culture, but language changes all the time. And as much as you try to take a snapshot of it and write it down and write down all these rules, as soon as you've done that, it's changed. And we all move on. Every generation does this. They complain about how the younger people are speaking wrong. Um, Nobody's ever wrong. We just all make it our own because that's how human language works. It's not meant to really be tied down, which is another reason writing is not a universal medium and that it's kind of weird. So give yourself a break if you have dyslexia in terms of forgiving yourself because it's really not that weird. Writing is weird. That's the weird part. Those of us who scratch on things and are for some reason really good at that. Anyway, my point is there are dialects of the same language. African American Vernacular English is a perfectly valid dialect of English. There are many different Southern dialects of English that many of us speak that are different from the dominant English that you hear on, news media or the grammar rules that get taught to you in the classroom. But they're still correct because they're a system with their own rules. Nobody has to teach you those rules. You are going to copy and use and generalize whatever grammar rules you end up hearing, no matter what language you're gesturing or speaking. So many of us may be speaking different dialects, but that doesn't mean that they're wrong. They're just different, and they just reflect different culture, and they're part of the rich tapestry of our multicultural nation. One particular example of the way we can tell that little kids are absorbing grammar is that they tend to make very systematic mistakes. No matter which language they're speaking, they make the same kinds of errors. So, what I mean by this is 4-year-olds, around the time kids hit 4, so far they had been copying phrases that they hear. They took telegraphic speech where they would just have, get, milk, all gone, a couple of words together, and that's it. They started forming sentences, and they would make sentences that sounded like stuff they had heard before, right? And they're using good past tense, and they're picking up on some good grammar, using pronouns appropriately. When they get to age 4, they start saying stuff like, we goed to the store instead of we went. They never heard anybody say that before, so they're not copying it anywhere, and they used to say it correctly just 6 months ago. So they do this because when they're 4, they're so smart, they have started to absorb the fact and notice and pick up on the pattern that adding ed to the end of something makes it past tense. So if we did something in the past, I'm going to say we go to the store. They're over-regularizing. They're taking this grammar rule and just applying it to words it doesn't quite apply to. But that's actually really smart of them because it's the English language that's a little wrong and inconsistent here. It shows you that humans have this innate ability to find and use a consistent pattern in our language. So they only learn through being a little bit corrected and just kind of absorbing, hearing other people talk that that's incorrect. But it's because we have irregular, weird verbs from our smushed together language from a bunch of languages. So it's really like went that's kind of the problem and not really the kid in that case. Again, language isn't wrong, but in this case, it's just inconsistent, and the child is understanding a rule and making that rule very consistent. And that's all for this little bit of our lecture. We're about to move on to the relationship between language and general intelligence.